Sure.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Tūrua ki ngā mate haere, haere, haere atura. E mihi ana te mana whenua o Ngāti Toa me Taranaki whānui. Ki a tātou e tau nei, kia ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora and welcome to Creative Mornings Wellington. Hands up if you are new here today. Yeah, like mostly over the side of the room. You new here, Andy.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
brand new.
So for those of you who are new, Creative Mornings is once a month here in Wellington. It's once a month all over the world for multiple different chapters. There's about 270 odd chapters in the world now, which is pretty cool. And across about 70 countries. So it's a global, you're part of a global community today. So our theme for this month is punk, which is a pretty cool theme. I've got a little synopsis for you that I'll read. Now it's meant to be sung. It's meant to be in the style of a punk song. However, I am not a singer, so I will not sing it. I will not do that to you this morning. Does the system feel broken? Staring at our screens, not hearing the screens. Wake up, wake up, wake up. We're not meant to go it alone. Find your people, lift them up. Do what you can with what you got. Wake up, wake up, wake up. Your creativity can save you. What you're going to make, what you're going to change. Wake up, wake up, wake up. So you can see that would be a lot better if I sang it. But that is, and this lovely piece of art is illustrated by Christina Portolano. And each month someone around the world from one of the chapters is chosen to create these art pieces that are representative of the theme. And a big shout out to our global sponsor, Adobe. Who uses Adobe software? Who's used it over the last week? Who used it yesterday? Guys, who used it this morning? Good, that'd be a bit hard. So as part of the sponsorship with Adobe, they've been offering Creative Mornings some really cool stuff. So there's if you check out on our Creative Mornings website, there's a lot more information, but there's a lot of upskilling that you can do with Adobe via Creative Mornings. So jump on the website and check it out. This program is called Level Up, and they're also offering creative apprenticeships at the moment. So check it out if that's of interest to you. And also we have local sponsors every single month that help us put these events together. We've got 6 Barrel Soda for our speaker gift, Libertine blends tea and coffee supreme for your drinks this morning alongside all good oat milk. Porniki Bakery for the bread. They very kindly delivered that to us because I wasn't in the country yesterday. Bad Baker Cookies for your breakfast cookies if that floats your boat. 40 Thieves for a delicious peanut butter. And Dough Bakery of course for our gluten-free loaf. Best gluten-free loaf in Wellington. 257 for this amazing space. If you need a place to work, come and work here. We do have a photographer. We did have a photographer, but I don't know where they are today, so never mind. And that kind of reminds me, if you're interested in photography and you'd like to volunteer sometime, we are on the lookout for more photographers to add to our pool of volunteer photographers. And we're also at the moment looking for people to help us out with social media. So if that's something that floats your boat, come and have a chat afterwards. We've got Andy on the camera this morning, Colourcraft for your labels, and also just our general amazing volunteers throughout the month. So the lovely Shutong made you breakfast this morning, thank you. And we've got Andrew at the back who's doing some live illustration today. And go back again. Without further ado, I will introduce you to Ross Gardiner. So Ross is a self-professed aging punk, and he's going to share a little bit of his story with you. And also, if you're keen afterwards, there's a bunch of ephemera over there for you to sort through and look through. Some really awesome stuff. Cool. I'll let you jump in, right? Here is your remote.
Put my glasses on to be able to read all of this. So I was approached to do this talk probably 6 weeks, couple of months ago. I was contacted by Claire, who had read an essay written by a friend, a little booklet here, And I thought, this is quite a big subject, and I don't want to bore everyone to death by trying to give some sort of comprehensive talk about what punk is and all the different styles and all that sort of thing. So I decided to base a talk more on what the theme of Sam's booklet was, which is about punk as a community, both here and around the world. So I'm going to try to explain some of that, but not be too concise about everything, but I'm going to look at the fundamentals of punk as it is a self-created scene or movement rather than something that is defined and marketed to you. Because the subject's quite vast, I'm going to do it from the perspective of how it's impacted on my life, sort of give it a bit of a personal spin without putting myself in the centre of it, but more how I sort of came across things and where that led me to where I am today, and travels around the world and contacts with people. And you're probably wondering from the advertising write-up for it, what the hell has this got to do with planting trees? Because, quote on the back cover of the book, fuck you, planting trees is punk. Punishing and joke that I'll get to at the end of this talk, so you have to stick around to find out. I'll start from the beginning for me. At some point in my childhood, probably a couple of years before I was intermediate age, I recall my older brother and sister telling me about a new kind of music called punk. They said it was so fast you couldn't understand the words, and that the bands couldn't even play their instruments. Even worse, they'd spit, puke and urinate on the stage and onto the crowd. And I was like, well, I can't believe anything like that would exist, Why the hell would anyone go and see those bands? Sometime later, my brother came home one night with a cassette tape with a few songs by a band called the Sex Pistols. It was just a bunch of their outtakes of old rock and roll songs and a lewd version of The Good Ship Venus, which caught my attention because it was the first time I'd heard a song with swearing in it. Later, he brought home their only real LP, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, which caused a massive controversy at the time by the feature of the word bollocks, which is pretty tame nowadays, but it sort of shows how quaint things were when you look back at it. What was so outrageous then is quite normal now, Having blue hair then would literally get you beaten up. People hated punk for the way they looked in that, but blue hair is quite common now. You see people in business suits have dyed hair and things. But anyway, I kind of hated that Sex Pistols album because it sounded really harsh. And after a childhood of listening to stuff like the Bee Gees, Ray Wolf and the Electric Light Orchestra, it was something from another planet. But track 2 on side 1 used the word fuck 5 times in 2 lines. And I was just blown away. It's like, what? These guys are going to burn in hell for sure. I was intrigued, but it wasn't until I heard my brother playing Buzzcocks and other music at a different kitchen that really caught my attention. I mean, it was punk, but it was a lot more melodic, which, compared to the Sex Pistols, it was a bit more accessible, but even so, it was still really rough for back in those days, and people hated it. It's kind of ironic that a lot of these bands are considered kind of classic rock now, I guess you could say. But that convinced me that punk was something I should check out a bit more, but, from where, I was primary, intermediate age at that point. I couldn't figure out why these bands seemed to be so antisocial in that. But it wasn't till a few years later I was rummaging around in the wardrobe at home and I came across an old copy of Mad magazine. And there was a 4-page satire called Mad's Punk Rock Group of the Year, which was basically a satire on the Sex Pistols. That had, as part of the story, the band urinating on the crowd and vomiting on stage. I was like, okay, so that's where my brother and sister got that idea. But a lot of people actually did believe that. They just thought punks couldn't play, they were just the worst people on earth, And if you told people you're into punk, you often sort of got looked down on. People would sort of be rude to you or whatever, or just make fun of it. But I didn't care, I was sort of interested in it. Let's see. The stereotypes do exist for a reason, and the wild and obnoxious look and sound of punk were easy to exaggerate. But what was often portrayed as incompetence was often a misunderstanding of what caused punk to explode in the mid-1970s. And it was a complete reinvention of rock and roll, a reaction against long-winded and complex music that rock had become during the sort of later 60s and into the 70s. it brought back the idea of going back to the 3-minute or less and to-the-point song, best summed up by an article in mid-70s New York magazine called Punk, which is sort of attributed to where the term punk rock came from. The article proclaimed, "Here are 3 chords, now start a band." The fuse was lit and a new musical movement took off. It encouraged people to get out there and create, rather than spend years perfecting their style and then hope that they would get noticed by music industry talent scouts. This amateur enthusiasm, combined with the often limited financial means for instruments and recording, certainly contributed to the idea that punks couldn't play. But who cares if it's noise? It's our noise. And of course, as countless bands have demonstrated, you can only improve. A great quote from that early era is, "It's rock and roll again, and this time we're all Elvis." Luckily it's sexy 1950s Elvis, not the bloated 1970s again. So I had a friend at school called Jamie who knew a bit about punk. He also had an older brother who had gone to see a few punk bands, and we'd sort of glean bits of information from him. I was around at Jamie's house one day and we were mucking around in his brother's bedroom. He had like one of those old wooden box record players with a radio in it, and we were sort of mucking around with the radio dial, and we tuned into a radio station playing punk. And we're like, wow, really? A New Zealand radio station playing punk? It turned out that it was the Auckland University station 1XB, which later became BFM. And it's sort of our introduction to radio being run more by people who are enthusiasts of music rather than a company playing the latest hits to you. A few years later, BFM ran a 2-hour punk show every Thursday evening, which we would always tune into and sometimes go into the studio and help out. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself there. I'd quickly learned that punk wasn't popular, but when I got to high school, I'd met a few guys who were also interested, so we decided to form a band. Dave could play guitar, so I opted for bass. It only had 4 strings and you only had to play 1 string at a time, so how hard could it be? There's a photo of us there. That's our first year of high school. That's me on the right, looking like I'm about 10 years old. We called ourselves the Parasites because it sounded punk, and I guess we sounded as punk as you could get with no distortion pedal. We played the school talent quest that year and we came 7th. Out of about 15, so it was okay. The following year we had a lineup change and became Service 42. That's me on the left there. We came 4th that year. That's because the school had got in some DJs from a radio station, hence the banner up the top. But it's sort of probably the more wild of the FM radio stations in Auckland. And one of the DJs for that station was Andrew Boak from a punk band called No Tag, who were quite well known, and we were just blown away that he was going to be the judge of our talent quest. So we came 4th, which we were quite pleased with. But in terms of punk rock credibility, the following year we did even better because we got disqualified for being too loud. We were proud of ourselves, and I still have the judges' form somewhere at home where one of the judges had written, "Too loud, distortion destroyed all the good work." But yeah, Dave had finally got a distortion pedal. There was no stopping us, except we broke up a year or 2 later as we all left school at different times and drifted off. But we all sort of kept in touch, and we all carried on with different bands. Dave, who's on the right there, he played guitar in New Zealand's first speed metal band a few years later. They were called Enigma, and they opened for Metallica at their first New Zealand show when Dave was about 18. And he's now gone on to become the guitarist for Gin Wigmore, living in the States. The rest of the guys, like Chris on drums and Jamie on rhythm guitar, played in a few bands. Most of them you've probably never heard of. They were in Libretta Suede in the Motel 6 for a while, a few years ago. The guy's singing, we haven't really seen him since high school. He became a lawyer. Lived in Singapore, invested money, and he's now retired for life. But again, I digress a bit. Before high school, Jamie and I had walked into the Farmers Department store in central Auckland. It was a multi-store building and had vast different sections, and we walked into the book and magazine section and we're just blown away to see this magazine on the shelf called Punk Lives with a picture of Sid Vicious on the cover. It was their first issue, I bought a copy of it and read through it, but I was sort of aware of the earlier punk bands, but didn't really know much about the sort of more contemporary bands at the time in the early 1980s. So I was reading through it and was like, wow, I've got to check all these bands out. This is a cover of, oops, it's not changing.
Push the other way, like face it towards the back. Yeah.
This is my worst nightmare. This would happen. I've never done a slideshow with a talk before, so I figured things would go wrong. It was working before we were checking. Just an old man. Ah, here we go.
Yeah.
So that, I think, was the last issue that came out. I lost my copy of issue 1 years ago because I pulled it apart for posters and stuck them all over my walls. Yeah, so Punk Lives came from the UK, so it was very UK focused. So it gave us an idea of what was happening in other countries and that there was this whole new scene around other parts of the world to discover. But it didn't really inspire you to write articles about bands or anything. What did though is One World magazine, or more correctly fanzine, which I'll talk a little bit about the concept of fanzines. But like one Sunday night, some of you probably older people would remember there was a TV show called Radio of Pictures, which was like an alternative music show. And one Sunday the host Karen Hay held up a copy of One World and said it was a punk magazine made by punks, and it was available in all good record stores. So the following weekend I shot off into town to get a copy, and it was my introduction to the concept of a fanzine, or zine for short, which is a self-published magazine by fans of whatever their obsession was. Most of them are about music and a huge amount of them are about punk. And within a few months of this coming out, punk zines are popping up all around the country, including from really unexpected places like Whangarei, but also a zine from Masterton and other places that were not a hotbed of punk rock. But people had sort of heard of or caught onto the concept of a fanzine and realised they could write articles about the bands they like and about things they're into, like Caveat Emptor. The guys are really into skating back when skating wasn't really huge, and it sort of got the sort of 70s fad of skating had died off, and in the 80s it was a lot of punks were into skating and not too many other people. And so I got involved in a zine with the guys in the band at school, and in the pre-internet and cell phone era we were all writing letters to bands and zine editors all around New Zealand and overseas. The era of punk making its own media had begun, or had been happening for a few years in other countries, but by the early 1980s it was really taking off. There were a couple of US zines, one called Flipside and later Maximum Rock and Roll, that really became global. I think at its peak, Maximum Rock and Roll, or MRR for short, was selling about 10,000 copies a month. And it featured things called scene reports, which are articles written by people about the scene in their city or their country. And it was really an idea of punks talking to each other, creating our own media and becoming sort of aware of each other, what was going on in other places, and inspiring each other. It's us talking to ourselves and not a music press that was distanced from our scene. Another really important part of the punk media was the compilation album. And they became increasingly common, and sometimes I'd cover a local scene, like in New Zealand, AK-79 has sort of gone down as a classic of New Zealand music history. But a lot of compilations are becoming international, like Maximum Rock and Roll released a series of albums because they'd sort of become a focal point for gathering information from around the world and giving bands a chance to release stuff that never would have got a chance to. So when I got welcomed in 1984, it really woke me up to the fact that there are punk bands all around the place, not just like where you'd expect from the US and UK, but also weird places like Finland, Yugoslavia and Brazil. Then one day I walked into a record shop and found a cassette release compilation called World Class Punk, released by Michael Board, who was a long-time columnist for Maximum Rock and Roll magazine. that had 27 bands in 25 countries, including even weirder places like Iceland, Czechoslovakia, South Africa, Colombia, and even New Zealand. But like many other good comps, they always included artwork, lyrics, and contact details for the bands. I'll put a couple of the comps over there just to give you an idea of what it was all about. Like the insert for the Wellington 1984 compilation just had little bits of artwork by all the bands with their lyrics and things like that. I mean, it's sort of, I guess you could say it was like a crap music version of Skynet from Terminator Judgment Day. Punk was becoming globally self-aware, and while punk's increasing self-awareness didn't cause governments around the world to try and shut it down, some did give it a try. In the Eastern European communist dictatorships, it was really hard to be punk. In the 1970s and 80s, it was seen as a serious threat to socialist order. In East Germany, punk bands found a surprising way to avoid being violently shut down. They'd play in the basements of churches, as the state did respect the sanctuary of the church, and that way they could play without getting beaten up or their equipment confiscated. And in the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, the Komsomol, the Communist Youth Organization, produced a list of 38 bands that were banned from being played at the government-owned nightclubs. Guilty of the charge of being punk were bands like the Ramones, the Clash, Sex Pistols, Blondie, and the Stooges, but the stale old commies weren't really that clued up, because also guilty of being punk were the B-52s, Yazoo, and even Kiss, who were also accused of neo-fascism. And I have a clear memory from the mid-80s of going around to a friend's house to buy a record. I was standing around on his driveway and got this one. This is a Polish band called Deserter. I'll just bring up the lyrics from this record. Now, Deserter had pulled off a major coup. There was only one record label in Poland. It was owned by the government, and they would not release anything that was contrary to state ideologies. So Deserter got around that by writing lyrics that were so obviously sarcastic, but fitting in with state ideology. You know? That one there, it's like, you know, ask the policeman, he'll tell you the truth, he'll show you the way. The state couldn't find a reason to ban that. But obviously they were just saying nice things in the face of the state while pissing on its shoes. Let's see. So when I went to buy that record, I sort of felt a bit like I was in a really bad Cold War spy movie. You know, I'm buying this punk record that seemed to be smuggled out of Poland. It sort of felt like there'd be someone from the Polish version of the KGB watching and photographing for evidence against me. But it sort of woke me up, or it sort of showed me the sort of difficulties that people had in other countries. You know, here you put up with petty harassment, people abusing you on the street or something, but in Poland you could be jailed for being punk. Meanwhile, in the USA, the Christian right had begun starting a campaign to save the world from the evils of punk, heavy metal, and Dungeons and Dragons. Some of the campaigning was so out of touch it was laughable. This here is a frame from a comic, or a series of 36 or so evangelical Christian comics. They are called Chick Tracts, which is kind of an odd name. A lot of them were written by a guy from Christchurch called Ray Comfort, who had moved to the States. But, you know, two of my flatmates bought the whole series of these comics, and none of them were particularly convincing. I mean, it's kind of laughable. It shows how out of touch they were, but that was sort of mild, really, you know, that sort of whole thing that punk and heavy metal were going to lead people to the devil wasn't taken too seriously by most people. But on a more serious note, there was a group that popped up in the States in the mid-80s called the Parents Music Resource Center, which is fronted by Tipper Gore, the wife of politician Al Gore. They took Jello Biafra, the vocalist for a prominent San Francisco punk band Dead Kennedys, to court, alleging that a poster that came with their third LP was pornographic. The picture was by Swiss surrealist artist H.R. Giger, who was famed a few years earlier for his design work on the Alien movie. That came as a poster folded up inside the album cover, and Biafra argued that the artwork, titled Penis Landscape, was a metaphor for consumer culture on parade. The PMRC argued that the album was a Trojan horse wheeling pornography into the homes of unsuspecting youth. But the jury sided with Jello and he won the case, but it had almost bankrupted him and his record label. Tipper Gore had said to the media that by trying to prosecute him, the PMRC was sending a cost-effective message, which is a sly way of saying that they went after a band with limited financial resources. Another few examples of the fun police at work can be found in Singapore, where in the early punk scene there was a band called Opposition Party, but they often had to advertise their shows calling their band OP to avoid police attention, because their name was a joking reference to the fact that there was no genuine opposition party in Singapore politics, and even pointing that out could get you arrested. Punk scene sort of took off in Malaysia in the sort of late 80s, early 1990s. A lot of the punks in Malaysia were not particularly religious, a lot of them were quite atheistic. But in a country that was sort of quite conservative Muslim, it was quite hard to be outspoken about that. And a friend was in Malaysia about 10 years back during Ramadan, and he commented that some of the punks he'd stay with would eat and drink alcohol during daylight hours, but only behind closed curtains, you know. There was no tolerance of not observing religious protocols, and if you wanted to be outside of the norm, you had to be really careful. This here is a frame from a short documentary on Vice TV about punks in Aceh province of Indonesia. Aceh province is run under Sharia law, and there have been a growing punk scene in Indonesia starting in the late 90s. It became quite big, you know, they play festivals with a few thousand people, but in Aceh in West Indonesia, being under Sharia rule, this very quickly brought them to the attention of the authorities, and a huge group of punks were rounded up, had their heads shaved, they were thrown into a lake and then put into military uniforms and marched around, and punk bands were banned from playing live, so they had to become really careful about what they did in public, and you know, had to do really underground gigs to avoid being arrested. So I'll now just move on briefly to talk a little bit about punk art. This is a huge topic and one I couldn't do justice, so I'll just pick one artist who had a big influence in the political end of punk, and that was a woman called G. Vulture, who did the album artwork for a UK band called Crass. Her album covers were often quite amazing, you know, they're these gatefold things that fold out into these big posters, a lot of which people would stick on their bedroom walls. And I mean, if you're like me, you got quite a few of their records second hand, so you wouldn't get the posters with them because, you know, they'll probably still on somebody's bedroom. This is one of their more famous ones. It's a sort of parody of the World War I poster, Your Country Needs You, with Lord Kitchener standing there pointing a finger. Very graphic, but it sort of showcases the provocative style of a lot of punk art, to sort of show you something that might be awkward or uncomfortable, but to get you thinking about it. Probably one of her better artworks was this one, which came with Christ the album, except for my copy, so I've had to take, that's a photograph taken from her book, which I've got on a table over there with a whole lot of other stuff that you can have a look at. And at first appearance you'd think this is like a collage of photos she's cut out and glued together, but it's all hand drawn. She was quite an amazing artist. Did a lot of commission work for magazines and newspapers and things like that. And over on the table over there is stuff for you to have a look at after the talk. I've put another poster by a UK band called Rudimentary Peni. And it's one of the most insanely detailed etching style drawings you'll ever see. His artwork was quite incredible, and not the sort of thing that most bands would try and imitate. Unlike some of the Crass artwork, the sort of basic format of it often had on the covers, you know, the stencil writing around it, which a lot of bands started to imitate, most of them doing it quite poorly. You know, they had the Crass logo with a circular logo. So for a while you did get a lot of bands doing similar style logos, and they got a bit generic. But a Wellington band a few years ago picked up on that style but played it off really well. I was walking about I think it was around 2017, I was walking through Newtown and I was looking at the different gig posters on the walls, and one caught my eye, and it featured a picture of a winged vulva firing a rainbow laser beam into Donald Trump's mouth. His brain's exploding out the back of his head, and I was like, holy crap. And I looked at it as a poster was advertising a gig for a band called Unsanitary Napkin. I was like, oh God, I've got to be a punk band with a name like that. So I went and saw them. I was like, wow, yeah, I'm definitely glad I went and saw that. I want you to think of that band for a couple of seconds. Your brain is never going to be the same again. The following year they put out an album with similar artwork, which is both genius and really disturbing. I'm not going to leave that up there for a while. Might want to stare at the floor. Unsanitary Napkin, I think, is one of the greatest punk band names ever. There's a few others that I think are up there. There's a Canadian band, Dayglow Abortions, which is really snotty, obnoxious punk rock, but probably one of the other better ones was an early Auckland punk band called Proud Scum. You know, the name says it all. And the guitarist of Unsanitary Napkin does a lot of the artwork, and she has had it exhibited in Wellington before. And I mean, her style is obviously influenced by the Crass artwork, but it's definitely not derivative. Now I'm going to move on to talking a bit about punk creating its own infrastructure and creating its own scene. Sort of looking at the DIY aspect of it, you know, creating our own. I've talked about creating our own media in the form of fanzines and doing radio shows. Now I'll talk a little bit about running our own record labels, venues, and touring. Okay, so that initial wave of punk in the UK and New York had seen some interest from major record labels with a few bands like the Ramones, Sex Pistols and the Clash getting record deals with major labels, but the Sex Pistols were promptly dropped by EMI and A&M Records for being too controversial. Once that initial phase of punk was over, major labels really dropped it. You know, some of the bands could be commercially viable. The Clash went on to achieve major success, but most punk bands didn't, and so punk sort of disappeared off the radar for a lot of people, but it did keep on going, you know. Punk had created its own do-it-yourself network of record labels, fanzines, and a growing local touring network that avoided having to deal with the mainstream booking agents and the potential for being ripped off or just marginalised from it. And this concept became international. In places like Aotearoa, it was essential as punk was never commercially viable, and this concept influenced non-mainstream musicians, with Flying Nun Records being hugely influenced by the example of punk, to just make your own music, don't allow producers to try and tone it down and commercialise it, just do what you believe and release it and you'll find your audience. And by the 1990s, this DI network had led to some bands catching mainstream attention, with the likes of The Offspring and Green Day getting major record label deals. Of course, this caused debate and a lot of hissing and hair pulling about selling out, but I'm not going to bother going into that because the scene itself continued, and a DIY record label was often a good way to lose money, or at least to break even. Some, like Alternative Tentacles, the Dead Kennedys record label, were hugely successful. And Mordam Records, whose first release in the mid-1980s was an LP by a fairly obscure San Francisco band called Faith No More, went on to become a major distributor of other independent labels. They really helped labels that could never get their stuff in the shops or sold internationally by sort of conglomerating it all into one mail order thing, you know. It's pre-internet, you had to write off for a catalogue and then get a check made up at the bank and post it off to get your records, but it really helped bands to get more of an international market, especially if you were from places a bit more far-flung like Australia or New Zealand or anything like that. And there are many of these DIY labels sprung up around the world, too numerous to mention, and new technologies such as CDs and the ability to produce small runs of 50 to 100 CDs made it possible for local bands to make a release without needing a lot of cash up front, and also avoided bands being stuck with a box of 100 or more unsold records, because a lot of pressing plants would only do 300 as a minimum requirement. Digital technology largely killed CDs, but vinyl's made a slight resurgence, as you usually get a free digital download with a vinyl release. And digital technology has reduced the necessity for a DIY recording distribution, but it's also opened up a new world of online releases, especially for music videos, for bands to be able to record something and release it for minimal cost and to get quite a lot of people listening to it. It's also allowed people to check out music that they may not usually have listened to. You know, if you went into a record store, you'd often have sections you'd look at and you wouldn't risk spending $20 or something on an album you may not like or anything like that. Now moving on to music venues, you know, being outside of the mainstream could make it difficult to find places to play. Although pubs are a common venue, usually holding anything from 80 to 400 people. But for punk, community halls often became a venue of choice, as they were all ages. And locally, the 90s were probably the golden age for this, as local councils didn't often enforce too many rules on you, other than noise levels and finish times. You know, you could get away with having alcohol in the venues back then because councils didn't seem to notice it too much so long as you looked after the place. And the semi-collapse of inner-city warehouse and office spaces in the late 80s and early 90s saw a lot of people living, often illegally, in commercial warehouse or office space. And these often became rehearsal spaces and occasional venues for a lot of bands in cities all around New Zealand. I mean, a friend from the UK who was visiting in the early 90s was quite blown away that every city he went to seemed to have a warehouse full of people with all this space. And it was quite amazingly cheap because the inner city in a lot of parts of New Zealand had collapsed as industrial companies like warehousing that moved into the fringes of the city into new built industrial parks. So we often got really cheap places in I lived in a big warehouse opposite Victoria Park in central Auckland. It was probably about the size of 2 houses and it cost $255 a week rent, which was often split between 10 of us and some other friends. I should imagine that in central Auckland now. And some other friends lived in a former strip club off Fort Street. One of my friends, actually, his bedroom was a peep show room. So every wall of his bedroom had a little window there. It was quite disturbing. And some other guys lived in a sort of office space above a porno cinema over the road. So it was a little bit seedy, but often funny. Like they had a show there one time and I was standing by the door. And because it was the red light district, you get these mobs of guys come wandering in because they'd hear music. And they'd walk up to the door and they're like, oh, there are chicks in there. And be like, yeah, $5. Yeah, great. They'd walk in and they'd come out 5 minutes later and be like, oh, shit. In Wellington, there was a warehouse just off the top of Cuba Street called the Empire Warehouse, which was a rehearsal space and occasional venue for a lot of local bands, including Shehard and Head Like a Hole, who went on to become huge. Internationally, there's a similar situation in many countries. Sometimes they're short-lived and sometimes they ran for decades. Sometimes they were rented spaces, but particularly in Europe, they were often squatted places where people would take over abandoned buildings. Oops, not meant to be there. This here is a place in Berlin called the Kirpi. And from above it's sort of U-shaped, but originally the building was a big square with an inner courtyard. And as you can see on each side, it's a ruin because basically half the building was destroyed in the bombing of Berlin during the Second World War. But that was just over the Berlin Wall. So when that wall came down, a whole lot of people from West Berlin went over into East Berlin and found these abandoned buildings and took them over, and that place is still running now. It was built as housing for workers with a whole lot of facilities for them, like in the ground floor. There was a restaurant there, which is now their gig venue. Every now and then there's been an attempt to evict them as property developers have tried to buy the building, but strangely all of those property developers ended up getting jailed or whatever for fraud, basically. I don't quite know what was going on, but you know, they just had all sorts of tax irregularities that has kept the police at bay from evicting them. This is the 1 in 12 Club in Bradford in the UK. The 1 in 12 Club was started as an unemployed rights kind of organisation that sort of branched out. They would do cheap gigs for the bands, and then eventually they got their own building and started putting on shows. And then here, this is ABC Rio in New York, which I went to in the late 90s. As far as I'm aware, it's still running, but these are all examples of people running their own small-scale venues that have sort of been a really important part for bands touring, especially. You know, you can just contact the venue and arrange to play there. Sometimes they have a wait list of 6 months or something because they've become so popular. But as this network of record labels, zines, radio shows and DIY venues evolved, they created a wider network allowing bands to book their own tours, bypassing booking agents who are either notorious for ripping off bands or were simply not interested. And the network ran on the enthusiasm and abilities of those involved, so results could vary to say the least, but with experience gained, some venues and organisers have become very proficient. Back in the olden days before the internet, organising a tour, especially internationally, could be very difficult, especially outside of Europe and North America, who had sort of begun to develop their own internal touring network. But if you were from outside of that, it was hard to get in contact with everyone because you literally had to write to them or ring them up, which could get really expensive but also just very slow. Maximum Rock and Roll magazine began featuring a page in each issue called Book Your Own Fucking Tour, which is basically a listing that people would write in and they'd give their name, contact details, and offer to arrange a local show for a touring band. So that allowed bands to sort of network with promoters who were fans of the music themselves. It was a little bit clumsy because of the fact you had to ring or write, but it worked. And it began to expand beyond North America and quickly evolved into an annual publication called Book Your Own Fucking Life, which listed not only people that would help you put on a show, but also listed what the local punk radio shows when they was broadcasting, where the record stores were, places to hang out, and also people offering crash pads for people travelling through. And myself and my partner used this extensively to travel through North America, Europe and Southeast Asia in the early 1990s. In the course of 9 months, we paid for several nights accommodation the whole time, just because we're travelling on what's sort of now referred to as a punk passport. You know, if you're part of an international network, you can turn up in a town, meet a few people, and then you often get offers of places to stay and things like that. And then when you're at home, like I've had loads of people pass through houses I've lived in who have heard from a friend of a friend that it was a place to come and stay if you're in town. Returning from our first overseas trip in early 1994, myself and my partner moved to Wellington. And we planned to get involved in organising punk shows, only to find that Wellington was dead. There were a few venues, few bands. Cuba Street shut mid-afternoon on Saturday and was a ghost town on Sunday. It was a very different city to what it is now, and it really sucked. But slowly things picked up, and Thistle Hall at the top of Cuba Street became a major venue in that sort of revival of live music in central Wellington, because there's so few venues available for bands to play at, and pretty much none for bands that were too young to play in pubs. And we get local bands to play support for out-of-town bands, give all the money to the out-of-town band to cover their travelling costs. But then in 1995 we got the chance to run our first tour for an overseas band when myself and my partner Lynn were in North America in 1993. We'd met the singer of a band called Spitboy at a house we're staying at in Minneapolis. And about a week later, by chance, we ran into the guitarist of the band who was doing record reviews in the basement of Maximum Rock and Roll House. We'd talked to them and they both seemed vaguely interested in playing in the South Pacific. And then about a year and a half later, we heard that through Maximum Rock and Roll that they were planning to tour Australia and Japan. So I quickly wrote off to them explaining that if they got a flight with a stopover in New Zealand, it didn't incur much extra cost, but gave them the opportunity to play a few more shows. I got a reply from Karen, the guitarist, and amazingly they were prepared to step into the void and trust that we could do it. It involved a few letters and also a few phone calls to the US, but it all came together and they ended up playing in Palmerston North, Wellington, at Thistle Hall, and at our old warehouse home in Auckland, now known as the Black Lagoon. The following year we did a 4-day tour for a UK band called Citizen Fish. This time we had the luxury of a new technology called a fax machine, making contact faster than a letter and way cheaper than a phone call. And then by 1998 we had moved into the future. We had this thing called email, and we organised a tour for a band called Your Mother. They came and played. The music was sort of melodic hardcore, and this is when pop punk bands like Bad Religion and NoFX were becoming quite popular over here. And it made Your Mother more accessible, so we got them to play in Auckland, Napier, Masterton, Wellington and Palmerston North. The Masterton show was in the Masonic Hall, which was an odd choice for a venue, but it was all that was available, it was all ages, and it was quite a riot, really. Almost literally, as some of the local gang members showed up and were trying to drag Craig, the guitarist, off the stage, pulling his leg, going, fucking play, I'm trying to. It was pretty funny, a little bit scary, but that sort of, things like that happened, and it all went well. But I mean, our collective of people know it as Screaming Asylum Productions, which is named after the Screaming Asylum, a punk house in Mount Vic where many of us lived. Was not the pioneer of this sort of DIY touring. That honour falls to Brian Wafer, a record store owner in New Plymouth. In early 1990, Brian had put on a short tour for a speed metal band from Switzerland with the not very heavy metal name of Run Chicken Run. It was only $10 to get in, and that's when most international touring bands were charging 20 or 30 bucks. And it was pretty weird for a band that was completely unheard of to even bother touring here. But what had happened is a singer had basically come here for a holiday the year previously and convinced his bandmates to come over for a holiday, and they'd play a few shows and cover their costs. And, it sort of gave us a new idea for touring of like not treating it as something to, cover all your costs, but at least try and cover as much of it as you could. And previously the only way touring bands could tour over here was through a music industry booking agents. That meant that it was only the really well-known bands that ever came here. So for the 1980s, it was groups like the Clash, Dead Kennedys and the Ramones, and then the Hard-Ons in Sydney, played in Auckland towards the end of the 80s. So by the 90s, this sort of network that had been coalescing throughout the 1980s was really coming into its own. And Brian put on a tour in 1994 for a San Francisco band we'd met when Lynn and I were there the year previously. And that sort of tour was a good example of how the punk passport really worked. Like when Lynn and I had arrived in San Francisco, we'd been given a phone number from someone we'd stayed with in Minneapolis. He said, if you need somewhere to stay in San Francisco, ring this number and my friend will let you stay. But she wasn't home, so we're like, shit, what do we do? So we rang up the Epicenter switchboard, which was a community centre run by punks in San Francisco. They had a zine library, record store and things like that, but also they ran a sort of help network for people. You could ring up if you had some problems with things and they'd help you out. The woman who answered the phone said, okay, if you can't get hold of this other person, you need somewhere to stay, just come to my house. She gave us the address. She said, if I'm not home, just tell my flatmates you're a friend of Devon. My flatmates don't understand the punk thing where you can meet a complete stranger and invite them into your home. But if you tell them you know Devon, or you're a friend of Devon, they'll be fine with it, because they know Devon knows people all around the world, and they won't question why you're there. So we pulled up to the house, knocked on the door, hi, we're friends of Devon. They invited us in, gave us a room in the lounge, and then later that night, this guy with a shaved head popped his head in through the lounge door. He's like, hi. We're like, oh, hi, we're friends of Devon. He's like, oh, I'm Devon, who are you? So we explained to him what happened. And he's like, oh, right, you're from New Zealand, cool. And he sat down and talked with us. He was kind of fascinated. He'd only ever met one person from New Zealand before, which in New Zealand's 2 degrees of separation turned out to be a friend of ours from Auckland who'd gone there a couple of years earlier. And he was wondering how we're managing to travel to so many countries, seeing as neither of us had a particularly good income or anything. We're both working in factories in Auckland. And we told him how we'd managed to get this cheap round-the-world flight that gave us all these stopovers. And then we'd told him about this guy Brian, who had organised a tour for a band from Switzerland. And Devon got quite intrigued and he looked into it. And then the following year, all you could eat tour in New Zealand. They came here twice actually, and then Craig, the guitarist, also came in with this band, Your Mother, a few years later, and this was really beginning to build up with a lot more bands coming here, touring on that framework of get cheap flights and then play connected to a local network, so that way you'll get enough money to cover your costs, that it's not going to bankrupt you. But it started getting a lot more complex in terms of bands booking tours. Like, I'll just go back a few. So Devon and Craig went on to form a band called Conquest for Death, and they'd really gotten into this idea of touring and playing in places where bands didn't normally go to. So this was their 2008 tour that we organised New Zealand shows for. They also played Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, the Sultanate of Brunei, Hong Kong and China, just doing it entirely through local networks. And it's quite amazing for bands who weren't particularly well known at all to be able to do that sort of thing, but it's an example of what happens when people really pull together to make things happen. Craig, the guitarist, went on to become 2 times US air guitar champion and 1 time world air guitar champion. It was great because those guys are so funny, you know. They had a great sense of humour, and I think that's why they were able to tour so successfully, because they're quite engaging with people. I'll just read you a blurb. Craig released an air guitar 7-inch, which is pressed with no grooves on it. Side 1 features Airway to Heaven, and side B is Sound of Silence. And on the back he states, air guitaring was born in the bedroom under the threat of discovery, much like masturbation. Ditch the shame and you'll notice a marked improvement. This also applies to air guitar. I've put a few of the posters on the table over there and amongst all the zines of some of the bands that we'd organised tours for, and you probably not recognise the names of any of them, but I think they're a good example of how these bands can tour and how people just work together to make all that happen. This had all sort of been building for a long time. You know, in the mid-1980s there was a New York band called Artless that had made an attempt to tour the Pacific. Their singer Michael Board, who released that world-class punk compilation, had a lot of contacts around the world, but he tried writing to people in different countries saying, hey, my band want a tour, but you try and coordinate with New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines and a few other countries by mail to try and arrange a tour. It's just not going to happen. And it did have to really wait a few years for, I guess, the networks to really improve through creating our own media. To be able to do that before we started getting a lot of bands coming this way. I don't really have any major summaries or profound insights to offer to round up this talk. I was asked by Claire to speak after she had found an essay that a friend had written called Dumb Enough to Actually Try It. The essay was drawn on an interview with a number of people in Wellington from the punk scene, discussing how they've applied a range of skills they learned from their involvement in the scene to other aspects of life. The essay is available online. It's commissioned by the Pyramid Club on Taranaki Street, and you can get a hard copy version of it from the Freedom Shop in Newtown. Incidentally, Sam had a flatmate, a punk guy who was really into artwork and drawing comics. He was really into Tank Girl, and he used to produce his own little photocopied comic books, who ended up like sending his artwork off to a company overseas, and he ended up becoming an illustrator for Tank Girl comic, which, you know, he lived happily ever after with that one. There's a quote from the back cover of this booklet, which is how Claire got in touch with me, because she didn't really know anything about punk, and so she just Googled punk Wellington, and this essay came up. And she was kind of intrigued by this quote on the back, "Fuck you, planting trees is punk." And she's like, "What?" Contact me. It's like, what's this all about? Because in that essay I sort of mentioned a forest restoration project I'm involved in Island Bay called Manawa Karioi, and she was kind of interested in this weird connection between punk and that, and sort of got in touch with me. But there's not really a huge connection in a lot of ways between that project I've been working on for the last 25 years and punk rock, but at the same time there kind of is. The quote is a bit of an in-joke. I'm a bit of a punisher for long-running in-jokes and niche humour. It came from an idea I got from an article I read in a zine about punks who are so obsessively nerdy that they try to make every aspect of their life punk. Had a cartoon drawing of a guy with a mohawk gluing together a model aeroplane going, "Fuck you, model aeroplanes are punk." And so when Sam asked for a quote, I thought, well, I'm not going to try and do anything profound, I'm going to say something stupid. But just in the same way that I got a job organising an environmental conference by going to the interview and telling them about all my experience in organising punk tours and punk shows and radio shows and things like that, what I've learned from the punk scene I've managed to extrapolate to this project I work on in Island Bay. I got involved in 2000. I'd sort of been aware since I was a kid of the environmental destruction here of the forests throughout the 1800s and 1900s, and I had this idea in the back of my head I should do something about it, but I had no idea how to do it or anything like that. And I'd heard that a friend of mine, Morgan, who's over there, everyone say hi, Morgan. He was living at Tapu Tiranga Marae, and they had a 8-hectare block of land that they were restoring to forest. So I went and talked to Morgan and got a little bit involved. He would sort of show me around and talk a lot with me about what they were doing and that. And so I got involved, and then Morgan left town to go and pursue some environmental work in other parts of the country. Ended up going to live on a volcano in the South Pacific, and I was stuck on this project on my own. I was like, holy crap, what do I do now? But I sort of applied what I'd learned from things as to how to achieve as much as you can from really limited resources, and one of those best resources is people. Getting them involved and getting people to feel a sense of ownership rather than you turn up, get told what to do and then go away feeling you have no connection with it, which I think is just one of the more important things I've learned from punk. And so that's the end of my talk. If you have any questions, you can ask them, but also afterwards just have a look through the table there. I've got a whole bunch of punk scenes and a few records and artwork and things that I think sort of illustrate a bit more what I've been talking about.
It sounds like punk is very much just creating for the sake of creation, like very hard and fast. And you know, this counterculture aspect of it all, that's international. Do you, in your experience, like, what comes first? Like, are people drawn to punk like because of the music and then get into the counterculture and the, you know, rejection side of things, or is it the other way around? Of like,
it's quite a range of things. Like for me, I got into it because it just seemed like outrageous music, and I was sort of a bit of a dorky kid and didn't fit in with a lot of things. And I have noticed, like in your teenage years, a lot of the people that got involved with punk didn't really fit in with anything else, especially like when I was at high school. A lot of the guys were into like being aspiring boy racers, and the culture of that didn't really appeal to me. And punk is not some profound movement or anything like that. You know, one of the negatives of it, it can tolerate or even endorse a bit of nihilistic living amongst young people, but also it just gives you an opportunity to belong to something, but to create something as well. Like, punk has never been hugely popular, but when you look at it, the ratio of people making bands and things like that is really high. You know, we got some posters on the table there for a festival we did called Punk Fest that ran from 1996 to 2010. We'd have 20 bands playing, but the audience would be like somewhere in the 200 to 300 sometimes. So there was a really high ratio of that audience that were actually also in the bands, and that's because people really wanted to get involved. It just gave you an outlet, and people would work together. We often didn't have a lot of resources, you know. So you just work together, and yeah, I guess it gave a sense of community, and a bunch of people have gone on to do some quite amazing things. Like a friend of mine is a surgery or theatre nurse in Christchurch, and you know, they're wearing their scrubs and that, so you can't really see each other. And she noticed one of the doctors one day is looking at him, and he's playing punk in the theatre, like while he's doing an operation. She realised he was a guy that was in the punk scene a few years earlier, which is kind of surprising. But you find quite a lot of that. I think it sort of helps trigger people's creative impacts. So just getting back to that surgery thing, you know, there was a band in the UK called, I think it was Carcass, who did, like, they pioneered this style where their album covers would be pictures of surgery, gore and things like that. It was a really nerdy, weird thing to do, but that actually inspired a whole lot of people from the punk scene to get involved in medicine that normally have never done things, you know, become doctors and nurses, but, you know, dealing with trauma cases and things like that. It's kind of funny, but yeah, why people come to punk, there's a whole range of reasons, but I think central to it is it's part of a community you can get actively involved in rather than being a spectator.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that today. We're a bit over time, so
Okay.
thanks for hanging around. That's okay. It's not quarter past 9.
Shit,
Yeah.
I better pay.
But yeah, our next event. I can't remember the date off the top of my head. I think it's the actual last Friday of July. So keep an eye out on that. And yeah, if you have any interest in helping us out with photography or social media, come have a yard with me as I pack up. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.